Welcome back, viewers. It's often said that Hollywood is built on glamour, but look a little deeper. Its foundations are forged in blood. On screen, Wendy Barrie is the absolute embodiment of British aristocracy, a refined lady raised in the luxury reserved for the elite. But behind the camera, that precious rose belongs to Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. He's not a red carpet king. He's a cold-blooded killer who rose from the squalid slums of Brooklyn, a man who never signs autographs for fans, only death warrants. Some documents record that, fearing this underworld power, studio moguls turned their most elegant star into a bullet shield. And when she was no longer useful, they ruthlessly erased her from history. Why would a young lady born into a magnificent mansion fall into the arms of America's most notorious butcher? Two worlds separated by a chasm of morality. Why did fate bring them together? And the architect of that downfall didn't carry a script. He carried a gun. Bugsy Siegel wasn't a studio executive. He was a founding member of Murder Inc. Kitchen, sent to California to siphon Hollywood's wealth. He had money and guns, but he craved the one thing violence couldn't buy: legitimacy. While his friend George Raft and Countess Dorothy DeFrasso cracked the door to the elite, Bugsy needed a flawless passport to truly conquer the studio moguls who mocked him behind his back. He found that ultimate prize in Wendy Barrie, born Marguerite Wendy Jenkins and goddaughter to author J.M. Barrie. Wendy was Hollywood's pristine British rose. Fresh off her success in the private life of Henry VIII, she radiated an old-world elegance. In Los Angeles' cynical ecosystem, that immaculate reputation made her the perfect target. Bugsy didn't court her. He annexed her life. By wearing the aristocratic actress on his arm, he forced Hollywood's exclusive doors wide open. Security guards and police wouldn't dare stop a top-tier movie star, allowing a syndicate hitman to walk straight into the private back rooms of power. She was his golden ticket, a glamorous distraction that obscured the blood on his hands behind her immaculate star power. Wendy Barrie soon realized she had walked into a trap. The studio system that had brought her to America offered her no protection. The moguls who ran the studios operated like feudal lords. They owned their actors through ironclad contracts. They dictated who they dated, what they wore, and where they lived. But when it came to the mob, the moguls were cowards. The studios were facing immense financial pressure from the Great Depression and the rising power of labor unions. To keep the cameras rolling, the studio bosses made secret deals with the syndicate. They paid off mobsters to prevent strikes. They allowed criminals to infiltrate the industry. When Bugsy Siegel set his sights on Wendy, the studio executives conveniently looked the other way. They tacitly endorsed the relationship, thrilled that their leading lady was keeping a volatile mobster distracted. Wendy, initially blinded by the intoxicating mix of Hollywood glamour and underworld danger, soon found herself in far too deep. She knew exactly who Bugsy was. She knew about the bodies left in the trunks of cars. Yet she sat across from him at Chiro's, maintaining her poised aristocratic demeanor, while the hands cutting the steak were stained with blood. She became complicit in her own downfall. She provided the polished exterior that allowed a sociopath to operate in broad daylight, introducing him to directors and wealthy socialites. Every time she smiled for a photographer while holding his hand, she was giving a murderer a stamp of elite approval. The tragedy of Wendy Barrie wasn't just that she fell for a criminal. It was that the entire Hollywood machine happily used her romance as a buffer zone. She was the beautiful distraction holding the door open for a monster, unaware that the industry she was protecting would not hesitate to destroy her the moment the flash bulbs stopped popping. But the sheer magnitude of this snare cannot be grasped without looking at the immaculate construction of her public persona. The Hollywood machine did not just hire an actress. They imported an aristocrat. They purchased a bloodline. They bought a specific brand of European sophistication that American audiences craved during the bleakest years of the Great Depression. Wendy was the genuine article. And in a town built entirely on fake facades and painted backdrops, the genuine article was a highly prized, highly vulnerable commodity. She was born Marguerite Wendy Jenkins in Hong Kong. Her father was a wealthy English lawyer. Her early life was defined by the rigid, suffocating rules of the British colonial elite. She was educated in convent schools in England and finishing schools in Switzerland. She was taught how to walk, how to speak, how to pour tea, and how to suppress her emotions. She was groomed to marry well, to become a decorative wife to a titled gentleman. But Marguerite had a rebellious streak. She wanted the stage. She adopted the stage name Wendy Barrie, borrowing the surname from her godfather, the legendary author J.M. Barrie, the creator of Peter Pan. It was a bitterly ironic choice. She took the name of a man who wrote about a boy who refused to grow up, just as she was stepping into an industry that would force her to grow up faster and harder than she could ever imagine. Her breakthrough came in 1933. She was cast as Jane Seymour in Alexander Korda's masterpiece, The Private Life of Henry VIII. She starred opposite Charles Laughton. It was a massive international success. On screen, she was mesmerizing. She possessed a delicate porcelain beauty. She had high cheekbones, wide, expressive eyes, and a voice that carried the undeniable authority of the British upper class. She played a queen who was used as a pawn by a powerful, ruthless king. It was a role that would mirror her real life with terrifying accuracy. The camera loved her, but more importantly, the studio executives loved what she represented. When the film crossed the Atlantic and became a smash hit in the United States, Hollywood called. They did not just want her talent. They wanted her pedigree. Her arrival in Los Angeles was carefully orchestrated. She did not step off a dusty bus with a few dollars in her pocket like thousands of other hopeful girls. She arrived on a luxury ocean liner, greeted by studio publicists and photographers. She was given the star treatment from the moment her feet touched American soil. But the luxury was an illusion. It was a gilded cage. She was immediately locked into a long-term studio contract. In the 1930s, a studio contract was a document of indentured servitude. The studio owned your name, your image, your voice, and your time. They told you what movies to make. They told you what clothes to wear in public. They fabricated your romances for the gossip columns. They controlled your diet, your sleep schedule, and your social circle. Wendy Barrie thought she was an artist, arriving in the promised land. She quickly realized she was inventory. Paramount Pictures, and later RKO, went to work marketing their new British import. They put her in a relentless string of films. She worked 12 to 14 hours a day under blistering hot studio lights. She was exhausted, but she was never allowed to show it. The studio PR machine painted her as the epitome of high society. They photographed her at the polo grounds. They photographed her pouring tea in elegant gardens. They sold her to the American public as the ultimate symbol of class, and the American public bought it. During the Depression, people were starving. They were losing their homes. They went to the dark, air-conditioned movie theaters to escape. They wanted to see wealth. They wanted to see glamour. They wanted to look at Wendy Barrie wrapped in silk and diamonds and pretend for 2 hours that the world was not a cruel and desperate place. She became a fixture in Hollywood high society. She attended the lavish parties at Hearst Castle. She drank champagne with Charlie Chaplin, Clark Gable, and Cary Grant. She moved through these rooms with perfect grace, but the grace was a performance. Inside, she was isolated. Hollywood was a brutal, transactional town. The people smiling at her at these parties were constantly calculating her box office value. If her movies made money, she was their best friend. If she had a flop, she was invisible. She was a long way from London. She missed her family. She missed the unspoken rules of British society, where people at least had the decency to hide their greed. In Los Angeles, the greed was naked. It was aggressive. Everyone wanted something from her. Men with power wanted to sleep with her. Men without power wanted to use her name to get a meeting. She learned to keep her guard up. She learned to deliver quick, witty deflections. She used her aristocratic accent like a shield, keeping the aggressive American hustlers at a distance. But her shield was actually a beacon. By aggressively marketing her as an unreachable high-class aristocrat, the studios unintentionally painted a target on her back. In the underworld, where men made their fortunes through violence and extortion, money was easy to get. Respect was impossible. The gangsters who ran the rackets had suits tailored in Italy and cars custom-built in Detroit, but they were still viewed as animals by the social elite. They were banned from the country clubs. They were whispered about at the charity galas. For a man who has conquered the streets, the only thing left to conquer is society. And the fastest way to conquer society is to take possession of its most prized symbol. Wendy Barrie was the ultimate prize. She was not a chorus girl. She was not a desperate starlet willing to do anything for a speaking part. She was British royalty in the eyes of the public. She was the woman who played queens on screen. To a man who crawled out of the slums of Brooklyn, a woman like Wendy was the ultimate validation. If he could buy her time, if he could make her walk beside him, he proved to the world that his power was absolute. He proved that no amount of old money or studio protection could keep him out. She did not know the predators were watching her. She was too busy surviving the grueling schedule of the studio system. She was making film after film, appearing in mysteries, comedies, and dramas. She starred in The Hound of the Baskervilles. She starred in Five. Came back. She was working constantly, maintaining the illusion of the wealthy, carefree socialite. She went back to her empty house at night, took off her makeup, and prepared to do it all again the next day. She felt safe within the studio walls. She thought the moguls who controlled her contract would protect her. After all, she was a valuable asset. She generated revenue. But she was naive to the dark compromises the studios were making in the shadows. She did not know that the men who signed her paychecks were terrified of the men who controlled the local unions. She did not know that the movie industry was bleeding money to the mob to prevent strikes and sabotage. The studio system was a house of cards built on extortion. The moguls projected an image of absolute authority, but behind closed doors they were writing checks to men with broken noses and hidden guns. They considered it the cost of doing business, and they considered their actors to be part of the currency. Wendy Barrie was the perfect currency. She was beautiful, she was classy, and she was entirely dependent on the studio for her livelihood. She had no independent power. If the studio told her to attend a dinner party, she attended. If the studio told her to be nice to a potential investor, she was nice. She followed the rules because she was raised to follow the rules. She believed in authority. She believed in the system. She did not realize that the system was preparing to serve her on a silver platter. The East Coast syndicate was expanding. The old bootlegging days were over. The new frontier was gambling, labor racketeering, and Hollywood. They looked at the movie industry and saw a massive, unorganized pile of cash. They needed a man on the inside. They needed someone ruthless enough to terrify the studio bosses, but ambitious enough to infiltrate their social circles. They needed a man who understood the value of violence, but also understood the value of public relations. They sent Benjamin Siegel. When Bugsy moved to Los Angeles permanently, he did not hide in the shadows. He established himself as the premier syndicate representative on the West Coast, building a network of illegal wire services and gambling ships. He was ruthless and wildly ambitious, but he also harbored a deep, burning desire for legitimate fame. He possessed a terrifying magnetic charisma, a psychopath masquerading as a playboy. He quickly recognized the diplomatic value of the studio starlets. He saw how the moguls used them to grease the wheels of extortion. But Bugsy did not want to share. He wanted his own permanent fixture. He scanned the landscape of Hollywood talent, and his eyes locked onto the British aristocrat, Wendy Barrie. He did not approach her like a fan. He requisitioned her like a predator calculating a strike. He learned her schedule, the restaurants she frequented, and the executives who controlled her contract. He applied pressure not directly on her, but on the environment around her, making sure the studio bosses knew exactly who he wanted. The ease with which she was captured defies belief, until you look past Hollywood's concrete fortresses. The major studios were bleeding millions to the East Coast syndicate to prevent mob-controlled labor unions from shutting down theaters nationwide. Desperate to keep the cameras rolling, the moguls blurred the lines between high society and the Mafia, creating a culture of absolute cowardice and appeasement. The exact details of how Bugsy initiated his control remain buried. What likely started as an intoxicating flirtation with underworld danger quickly mutated into an inescapable trap. When Wendy realized the true, terrifying nature of the man she was with, she looked to her employers for salvation. But the studio executives, terrified of Siegel's reputation for extreme violence, simply looked the other way. To the studio fixers, her romance with Siegel was a convenient buffer, a way to pacify a ruthless hitman while protecting their profit margins. The betrayal was complete. The men who had brought her to America hadn't formally sold her to a hitman, but their silence signaled that her survival and her continued employment depended on keeping the monster happy. They threw her to the wolf to ensure their own survival. Wendy Barrie continued to smile for the cameras and hit her marks, maintaining the illusion of a carefree socialite, but she was completely isolated. She had no independent wealth to escape, and the police were thoroughly corrupted by mob money. There was no one to call. There was nowhere to run. She was a British aristocrat trapped in a California nightmare. The high concrete walls of the studio lot no longer looked like a fortress keeping the world out. They looked like the walls of a prison keeping her in. She realized with chilling clarity that her beauty, her talent, and her pristine reputation had not saved her. They had condemned her. They had made her the most desirable target in a city entirely run by criminals. The illusion of Hollywood was shattered completely. Behind the glamorous premieres and the silver screen magic, she saw the sordid, cowardly reality of the machine. It was a machine that ground up human dignity and traded it for mob protection. And she was the next piece of raw material on the conveyor belt. She braced herself. She put on her makeup. She practiced her lines. She prepared to play the most dangerous role of her life. She was no longer just an actress in a motion picture. She was the unwilling co-star in a real-life mob drama. She had to smile for the cameras. She had to hold the arm of a murderer. She had to walk onto the red carpet and pretend that the man beside her was a gentleman, knowing all the while that he held the power of life and death over her. The cameras flashed. The crowd cheered. The descent into the underworld had officially begun. Men like Benjamin Siegel collected things. They collected illicit gambling revenues. They collected the obituaries of their rivals. They collected custom silk suits tailored to hide the bulge of a shoulder holster. But in the ruthless hierarchy of the American underworld, cash and violence were common. Every syndicate boss had money. Every boss had killers on the payroll. To truly rise above the gutter, a man needed something money could not directly buy. He needed a veneer of absolute untouchable class. Bugsy Siegel looked at the landscape of Los Angeles and decided he did not just want to rule it. He wanted to wear it. He found his perfect accessory in Wendy Barrie. He did not pursue her with the clumsy affection of a starstruck fan. He annexed her. The relationship between the mobster and the movie star was a hostile takeover executed in broad daylight. Bugsy Siegel was a man who had scraped his way out of the slums of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. He had built his reputation on a foundation of broken bones and silenced witnesses. He was handsome, possessing a dark, volatile charisma, but the Hollywood elite could smell the street on him. The studio moguls and the old money socialites feared his temper, but they quietly mocked his desperation to fit in. They viewed him as a heavily armed peasant crashing a royal banquet. Bugsy felt that condescension. It burned a hole in his ego. He realized that a gun could force a man to hand over a suitcase full of cash, but it could not force a man to respect him. He needed a human shield of respectability. Wendy Barrie possessed a pedigree that could not be counterfeited. She was British. She was refined. She spoke with a crisp, aristocratic diction that instantly commanded deference in a room full of self-made American hustlers. By taking possession of her, Bugsy Siegel performed a brilliant, sociopathic magic trick. He forced the Hollywood establishment to accept him. The mechanics of his control were terrifyingly simple. He smothered her in proximity and wealth. He began appearing on her sets. He stood in the shadows just off camera, his arms crossed, watching her work. The directors noticed. The producers noticed. A chilling message rippled through the studio lot. Wendy Barrie belonged to the syndicate. Her co-stars suddenly treated her with nervous caution. The studio executives stopped demanding her presence at their own private functions. Bugsy effectively built an invisible fence around her. He isolated her from her peers, cutting off any potential avenues of escape or support. Then came the gifts. He showered her with diamonds, platinum bracelets, and imported furs. These were not romantic gestures. They were chains. In the criminal economy, every gift carries a ledger of debt. Bugsy draped the heavy jewels around her neck to mark his territory. When she walked into a room wearing his diamonds, every man in the criminal and legitimate worlds knew exactly who owned her. She could not refuse the gifts. Refusing Bugsy Siegel was an insult, and men had disappeared into the Mojave Desert for far less. She accepted the boxes. She wore the jewels. She felt the heavy, cold stones against her skin and knew she was wearing a collar. Their public appearances were master classes in psychological warfare. Bugsy orchestrated their outings with military precision. He chose the venues carefully: the Trocadero, Cyros, the Brown Derby, places where the elite gathered to see and be seen. When they arrived, the atmosphere in the room would undergo a sudden, violent shift. The music would continue playing, but the conversations would drop to an anxious murmur. The maitre d' would scramble to clear the best table in the house. Wendy walked ahead of him. She wore the silk gowns. She wore the flawless makeup. She held her head high, projecting the serene confidence of a movie star. But inside, her nervous system was redlining. She could feel the heat of his presence right behind her. Sometimes, he would place his hand on the small of her back to guide her through the crowd. She could feel the hard, unforgiving outline of the weapon hidden under his tailored jacket pressing briefly against her hip. It was a physical reminder of the stakes. They would approach a table occupied by a powerful studio head. The mogul would see Wendy Barrie and begin to stand out of respect for her status. Then he would see the man holding her arm. The blood would drain from the executive's face. But he had to stand. He had to smile. He had to kiss Wendy's hand and offer a warm greeting. Because Wendy was there, the mogul was forced to extend that same warm greeting to Bugsy Siegel. He had to pull out a chair. He had to offer a drink. He had to treat a ruthless contract killer like an esteemed colleague. Bugsy thrived in these moments. He soaked up the forced respect. He used Wendy's radiant presence to blind his victims. He would sit at the table, casually sipping a cocktail, and steer the conversation toward business. He would mention the projectionist union. He would mention the extras guild. He would drop subtle, terrifying hints about labor strikes or accidents on movie sets. He delivered these threats with a calm, charming smile, all while resting his hand over Wendy's. The men across the table looked at the beautiful aristocratic woman sitting quietly beside the gangster. Her presence created a horrifying cognitive dissonance. How could a man sitting next to a pristine English rose be a monster? But the moguls knew the truth. They looked at Wendy's perfectly painted smile and saw their own helplessness reflected back at them. If Bugsy Siegel could capture and control one of their biggest stars right in front of their eyes, what could he do to them? Wendy's presence amplified the threat. She was living proof of his absolute power. Wendy found herself at the epicenter of his volatile world. She sat at tables where Hollywood's elite rubbed shoulders with ruthless enforcers. Whether blinded by the danger or captivated by the intoxicating mix of power and glamour, she maintained her flawless aristocratic facade. She played the role of the devoted companion, masking whatever reservation she held behind a perfectly painted smile, lending an air of high society legitimacy to a man who resolved disputes with bullets. She lived in a constant state of calculated performance. She knew that Bugsy's temper was a hair trigger. He was famously paranoid and prone to violent outbursts. The wrong word, a lingering glance at another man, a slight hesitation in her compliance could set him off. Wendy became a bomb disposal expert. She learned to read the micro expressions on his face. She learned to anticipate his moods. If she sensed his anger rising, she would deploy her aristocratic charm to diffuse the situation. She would place a gentle hand on his arm. She would softly change the subject. She managed a psychopath daily, knowing that one failure could result in a brutal beating or worse. Bugsy used her to launder his reputation. The newspapers loved a glamorous couple. The gossip columnists, heavily influenced by studio PR departments and terrified of mob retaliation, wrote breathless articles about their romance. They called him a dashing businessman. They called her his leading lady. The press provided the final layer of the whitewash. They printed photos of the mobster and the movie star smiling on the red carpet. Millions of Americans read the papers and saw a Hollywood fairy tale. They saw wealth and romance. They did not see the invisible gun held to the starlet's head. Wendy Barrie became a prisoner of her own image. The public adored the elegant woman in the photographs. The studio profited from her films. Bugsy Siegel exploited her social capital. Everyone took a piece of her. She was a resource being mined to exhaustion. She had no friends she could trust. She could not confide in her co-stars because they were terrified of her association with the syndicate. She could not turn to the police because the police were on Bugsy's payroll. She was entirely isolated within a crowded city. She spent her nights in lavish hotel suites and exclusive mansions, surrounded by more wealth than she had ever seen. Yet she had never been poorer. She owned nothing. Her time, her body, and her public persona belonged entirely to Benjamin Siegel. He dictated her reality. He would tell her what to wear. He would tell her who to speak to. He treated her like a highly prized show dog. He groomed her, he displayed her, and he expected absolute obedience. The psychological degradation was profound. She was a woman who had trained to perform the works of Shakespeare. She had trained to embody complex, powerful women on stage and screen. Now, her only role was to serve as a decorative shield for a murderer. She had to swallow her pride, her ambition, and her moral compass just to survive the day. She had to look at her reflection in the mirror and reconcile the sophisticated aristocrat with the mobster's property. She knew he did not love her. A man like Bugsy Siegel was incapable of love. He was capable only of acquisition and possession. He looked at her and saw a mirror reflecting his own power back at him. She was a tool. She was a heavily insured asset. She was the customized hood ornament on his rapidly accelerating criminal enterprise. He drove that enterprise straight through the heart of Los Angeles, running over anyone in his path. And Wendy Barrie was strapped to the front, feeling the impact of every collision, unable to close her eyes, unable to turn the wheel, waiting for the inevitable crash. The descent from celebrated artist to human shield was not marked by a single dramatic event. It was a slow, suffocating process of erosion. She had spent her entire youth building a name, a posture, and a career. Bugsy Siegel dismantled it all and repurposed her as a tactical asset. He turned her life into a gilded cage where the bars were made of flash bulbs and newspaper clippings. By the late 1930s, the Hollywood social scene had become a theater of war for the American Mafia, and Wendy was stationed directly on the front lines. She was not holding a weapon. She was the camouflage. Wendy Barrie's true tactical value to a mob boss only makes sense when viewed through the corrupt lens of Los Angeles law enforcement. The Los Angeles Police Department was notoriously corrupt, but they were also highly sensitive to public relations. They routinely harassed small-time crooks and raided illegal gambling dens in the poorer districts. But the LAPD operated with extreme caution around the movie studios and their top-tier stars. The studio moguls held massive political influence. They could make or break a police chief. Consequently, a famous actress possessed a localized, invisible force field of immunity. Bugsy recognized this immediately. He knew that the police might stop a known syndicate hitman driving alone through Beverly Hills. They might search his car, they might find the unregistered firearms, or the ledgers detailing illegal betting operations. But the police would never pull over a Packard convertible if Wendy Barrie was sitting in the passenger seat. They would not dare subject a beloved British film star to the indignity of a roadside search. A patrolman looking into the car would see the famous face, tip his hat, and wave them through. Bugsy did not just date Wendy. He used her as human contraband. He moved through the city with absolute impunity. She was his legal armor. When they arrived at the Santa Monica Pier to inspect the offshore gambling ships, the local authorities looked the other way. When they walked into the lobby of the Beverly Hills Hotel, The security guard stood down. Bugsy could carry a loaded weapon under his tuxedo jacket right past the nose of the chief of police, simply because Wendy's hand was resting on his arm. She provided a distraction so bright and so perfect that no one looked closely at the man standing beside her. This immunity extended directly into his business operations. The syndicate was bleeding the Hollywood studios dry through union extortion. Bugsy needed to hold meetings with producers and studio executives to collect the payoffs. These were inherently dangerous encounters. A cornered studio boss might wear a wire. He might hire private detectives. He might panic and bring the authorities. Bugsy mitigated these risks by bringing Wendy to the drops. Bugsy arranged meetings at high-end restaurants and private clubs. The targets would arrive, sweating and terrified, expecting to meet a ruthless gangster. Instead, they found Wendy Barrie sitting there, sipping a martini, making polite conversation. Her aristocratic presence completely disarmed the room. It normalized the interaction, making a mob shakedown feel like a casual social encounter. The producers could not cause a scene without creating a massive scandal involving an A-list actress. Wendy's glamour trapped the victims just as effectively as it shielded Bugsy. She sat through these dinners in a state of quiet internal horror. She may not have seen briefcases of cash physically exchanging hands under the tablecloth, but she could feel the suffocating tension. She knew the men sitting across from them were being robbed of their livelihoods. She had to watch Bugsy smile his cold, dead smile and issue veiled threats, all while maintaining the serene, detached expression of a woman discussing the weather. The toll of living a double life began to mount. The script she memorized for the cameras was nothing compared to the performance required to navigate Bugsy Siegel's reality. The lines between her Hollywood persona and her ties to the syndicate blurred. The press eagerly consumed the scandalous romance, painting a picture of high society glamour while willfully ignoring the dark, violent undercurrents of her chosen companion. She began to split into two different people. There was Wendy Barrie, the actress, the woman who laughed in romantic comedies and wore silk gowns in promotional photos. Then there was Marguerite, the terrified woman trapped inside, watching her own life happen from a great distance. She felt a profound, sickening disgust for the industry that had abandoned her. The same studio executives who had pushed her into Bugsy's path now sat across from her at these extortion dinners, handing over their money, refusing to meet her eyes. They knew she was playing a deadly game, and they were more than happy to let her be the distraction. Their cowardice was undeniable. The press was equally complicit, though entirely ignorant of the truth. The gossip columnists fueled the nightmare. They printed photographs of Bugsy and Wendy at the racetracks and the nightclubs. They wrote glowing articles about the handsome, mysterious businessman and his glamorous British muse. They created a narrative of high society romance. Wendy read these articles and felt physically ill. The public was consuming a lie. They were looking at a photograph of a predator and his prey and calling it a love story. Every flash of a camera bulb was a reminder of her utility. She realized that Bugsy did not look at her with desire. He looked at her with the calculating assessment of a man checking the balance in his bank account. She was a resource. She was a tool used to pry open the vaults of Hollywood. She gave him the one thing his guns could not secure. She gave him a cloak of invincibility. The isolation became total. She could not write to her family in England about her reality. The syndicate monitored communications. She could not speak to her fellow actors. The fear of the mob had infected every corner of the studio lots. Conversation stopped when she walked into the commissary. People looked at her with a mixture of pity and terror. She was a walking contagion. Being too close to Wendy Barrie meant being too close to the syndicate. She was surrounded by thousands of people in a bustling, thriving industry, yet she lived in a vacuum. She started to understand the brutal, mechanical nature of the criminal mind. A man like Bugsy Siegel did not form attachments. He formed strategies. Wendy recognized the cold, mathematical precision of his actions. He brought her to a specific club on a specific night because a specific rival was watching. He bought her a specific necklace because a specific producer needed to see the display of wealth. Every public outing was a tactical maneuver. She was the chess piece he moved across the board to block his opponents and protect his king. But a pawn is only valuable as long as it serves the strategy. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was sitting in the passenger seat of his car, driving down Sunset Boulevard. The neon lights washed over his face. He was talking about a union boss who was causing problems. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as he discussed the logistics of murder. Wendy looked at his hands on the steering wheel. She saw the heavy gold ring on his finger. She saw the total absence of humanity in his profile. She realized she had an expiration date. A human shield is only useful if it draws fire or deflects attention. But the heat around Bugsy Siegel was rising. He was becoming too famous. His flamboyant lifestyle was attracting the wrong kind of attention. The FBI was beginning to build a massive file on his operations. Rival syndicate bosses on the East Coast were growing tired of his massive ego and his reckless spending. The invisible force field Wendy provided was starting to crack under the pressure of federal investigations. She knew what the Mafia did to assets that lost their utility. They did not offer severance packages. They did not allow for quiet retirements. When a tool became a liability, it was discarded. Sometimes it was discarded quietly. Sometimes it was buried in the desert. She felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. The glamorous life she had built, the aristocratic image she had cultivated, meant absolutely nothing in this car. She was entirely expendable. Bugsy was already looking past her. He was already calculating the next phase of his operation. He needed a different kind of partner. He needed someone who could navigate the criminal underworld, not just the Hollywood elite. He needed someone who could handle the illicit cash and manage the violent associates. He did not need a refined British actress anymore. The shift in his behavior was subtle at first. He stopped demanding her presence at every dinner. He began taking trips to Nevada without her. The phone calls became less frequent. The heavy, suffocating pressure of his control began to lift, but it was not replaced by freedom. It was replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. She was being phased out. Wendy Barrie stood in her luxurious Hollywood home and looked at the expensive gowns in her closet. She looked at the platinum jewelry sitting in the velvet boxes. These items were not gifts. They were the uniform of her captivity. She had survived the initial capture. She had survived the daily psychological torture of being an accomplice to a monster. But the most dangerous phase was just beginning. The transition from a prized possession to a discarded liability is a lethal corridor. She knew that Bugsy could not simply let her walk away. She knew too much. She had sat at the tables. She had heard the names. She had seen the payoffs. She was a walking liability to the entire West Coast syndicate. If the FBI subpoenaed her, if they pressured her to testify, she could bring down the entire Hollywood extortion racket. She was a loose end. And Bugsy Siegel was a man who specialized in tying up loose ends. The terror she felt now was different from the panic she had experienced when he first took control of her life. This was a cold, clinical dread. It was the dread of a woman waiting for the executioner's knock on the door. She had to navigate her exit with absolute precision. She could not show relief. She could not show defiance. She had to fade into the background. She had to make herself appear entirely harmless, entirely ignorant, and completely irrelevant to his future plans. She continued to show up at the studio. She continued to memorize her lines. She stood in front of the cameras and delivered her dialogue with the crisp, aristocratic perfection the audiences demanded. But behind her eyes, there was only the cold, hard calculus of survival. She was preparing for the moment the monster would finally let go of her arm. She knew that when he did, the real fall would begin. The studio would not catch her. The public would not catch her. She would be dropping in absolute freefall, carrying the weight of a reputation completely destroyed by the man who had used her as a human shield. The endgame was approaching, and Wendy Barrie knew the board was already rigged against her. The machinery of the American Mafia operates with a chilling, ruthless efficiency. It does not possess a heart. It does not harbor sentimentality. It only understands utility and profit. When a tool no longer serves a purpose, it is not placed gently on a shelf. It is discarded. Benjamin Siegel was a master of this brutal calculus. By the early 1940s, the strategic landscape of his criminal empire was shifting dramatically. He had squeezed the Hollywood studios dry. The labor unions were firmly under syndicate control. The extortion money was flowing steadily. But Bugsy was a megalomaniac. He was no longer satisfied with simply bleeding the movie industry. He wanted to build an empire of his own. He looked past the neon lights of Los Angeles and saw the barren, scorching expanse of the Nevada desert. He envisioned Las Vegas. He envisioned the Flamingo Hotel. This monumental shift in ambition required a completely different set of tools. Building a casino with illicit mob funds was not a high society dinner party. It was a massive, dangerous logistical nightmare. It required moving millions of dollars in stolen cash across state lines. It required dealing with violent contractors, corrupt politicians, and angry syndicate bosses in New York and Chicago who were funding the operation. Bugsy needed a partner who spoke the language of the underworld fluently. He needed someone who could carry a suitcase full of unmarked bills without flinching. He did not need a refined British aristocrat pouring tea. He needed a gangster. The relationship didn't end with a cinematic climax. It unraveled through the predictable chaos of a gangster's lifestyle. Bugsy Siegel was notoriously unfaithful, juggling affairs with multiple women, including the fiery syndicate associate, Virginia Hill. Virginia possessed a street-smart cunning and an underworld pedigree that matched his own. As Bugsy's ambitions shifted toward the Nevada desert, his high-profile romance with the British aristocrat quietly dissolved, leaving Wendy to face the public fallout alone. The transition was not marked by a dramatic confrontation. There was no tearful goodbye or explosive argument. Bugsy simply detached himself. The mechanics of his departure were terrifying in their silence. The heavy, suffocating presence that had dominated Wendy's life abruptly vanished. The late-night phone calls stopped. The unannounced visits to her film sets ceased. The bodyguard who used to trail her car disappeared. For a brief, confusing moment, Wendy felt a rush of absolute panic. In the world she had been forced to inhabit, a sudden silence usually meant a hit had been ordered. She waited for the retaliation. She waited for the door to be kicked in. She assumed her knowledge of his extortion rackets had finally made her a target for elimination. But the bullet never came. The truth was far more insulting. She was not a threat. She was completely irrelevant. Bugsy had evaluated her threat level and dismissed her. He knew she was a product of the British upper class. He knew she possessed an ingrained respect for authority and a deep-seated fear of scandal. He knew she would never go to the police because going to the police meant admitting her complicity to the world. She would never testify. She would simply fade away. He turned his back on her and walked into the desert with Virginia Hill, leaving Wendy standing alone in the ruins of her personal life. The sudden freedom was intoxicating, but it was incredibly dangerous. Wendy Barrie took a deep breath of the California air and believed for a fleeting, naive moment that she had survived. She had walked through the fire with the devil and emerged on the other side. She assumed she could simply return to her life. She assumed she could walk back onto the studio lot, put on her makeup, and resume her place as a beloved star of the silver screen. She severely underestimated the cowardice and the hypocrisy of the Hollywood machine. The climate in Los Angeles had changed rapidly. The federal government was finally waking up to the massive syndicate infiltration of the movie business. The FBI, under the strict direction of J. Edgar Hoover, was compiling massive dossiers on studio executives and their mob ties. Federal grand juries were being convened. Subpoenas were being drafted. The studio moguls, the men who had willingly paid millions in extortion money and handed their actresses over to hitmen, were suddenly terrified of going to federal prison. They needed to clean house. They needed to project an image of absolute moral purity to the government and the American public. They needed a scapegoat. Wendy Barrie walked into the executive offices expecting a warm welcome. She expected her agents to hand her new scripts. Instead, she hit a wall of solid ice. The smiles of the studio bosses were gone. The men who had previously forced her to attend dinners with Bugsy Siegel now refused to make eye contact with her. Her agents stopped returning her telephone calls. The scripts stopped arriving at her door. The studio system began a silent, brutal distancing. There was no formal trial, nor a dramatic official blacklist. Instead, it was a gradual, unanimous freezing out by the men who controlled the industry. Wendy Barrie had become a public relations liability. The studios let her current contracts quietly expire. The premium scripts stopped arriving, replaced by offers for low-budget B-movies. When independent producers tried to elevate her, major distributors hesitated. The doors of the premier sound stages slowly, deliberately closed. The very moguls who had pushed her into the mobster's orbit now judged her for the association, painting her as a corrupted woman who had willingly brought the mob to their doorstep. The social execution followed the professional one. Hollywood is a town built entirely on perceived value and proximity to power. When the studio signaled that Wendy was out, the social elite immediately abandoned her. The invitations to the lavish parties at Hearst Castle stopped arriving. The premiere tickets vanished. When she walked into a restaurant in Beverly Hills, the room no longer fell silent in awe. It fell silent in judgment. Former co-stars would quickly turn their heads and study the wallpaper to avoid greeting her. Directors who had praised her talent just months prior now crossed the street when they saw her coming. She was infected with a terminal social disease. She was a ghost haunting a city she had helped build. The gossip columnists delivered the final fatal blows. Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper wielded immense, terrifying power over public opinion. They were intimately tied to the studio bosses, serving as the unofficial propaganda arm of the movie industry. The studios fed the columnists the new narrative. The columns began to run vicious, thinly veiled blind items about a certain British actress and her unsavory underworld connections. They questioned her character. They mocked her sudden lack of employment. They destroyed the pristine, aristocratic image that had taken years to cultivate. The public, eager for a scandal, devoured the lies. The elegant English Rose was recast as a syndicate tramp. Wendy sat alone in her house. The phone, which used to ring constantly with offers and invitations, was completely silent. The silence was heavier and more oppressive than the noise of Bugsy's world. She realized the magnitude of the betrayal. The Mafia had used her body and her reputation, but they had never pretended to be anything other than monsters. The studio executives had smiled at her, called her family, and promised to protect her, only to stab her in the back the moment it became politically convenient. She had survived the physical threat of a notorious hitman, only to be professionally murdered by men in expensive suits holding fountain pens. The financial and social realities of a Hollywood scandal set in with the brutal force of a ticking clock. She watched from the sidelines as the men who had orchestrated her nightmare thrived, lying smoothly to federal committees about their mob connections, while she was left destitute and disgraced. The golden age of her cinematic career was definitively over. The centuries of the Hollywood establishment had received their orders, and the blacklist was strictly enforced. The studio moguls expected her to quietly disappear, to fade into obscure poverty and carry the shameful secret of their mob appeasement to her grave. But they fundamentally misunderstood the woman they had thrown to the wolves. Wendy Barrie possessed the refined manners of a British noblewoman, but beneath the silk and the etiquette was a core of forged steel. She refused to starve. She refused to be destroyed by their cowardice. If the silver screen was denied to her, she would find another lens. She turned her back on Los Angeles. The city was poisoned ground. The palm trees and the sunshine offered nothing but the suffocating memory of Benjamin Siegel and the profound cowardice of the studio executives. She packed whatever she had managed to salvage from the financial wreckage and boarded a train headed east. She moved to New York City. New York was a colder, harder, more unforgiving landscape, but it lacked the specific, insidious hypocrisy of the Hollywood studio system. More importantly, New York was the epicenter of a chaotic, rapidly expanding, entirely unproven new industry. It was the birthplace of commercial television. In the late 1940s, television was viewed by the film elite with deep contempt. The moguls in California considered the small, flickering box in the living room to be a cheap, low-class gimmick. Established film stars refused to appear on television. It was considered professional suicide. The broadcasting schedules were filled with former vaudeville performers, desperate unknowns, and aging actors who had run out of options. It was a dumping ground. For a woman who had starred in international cinematic masterpieces, stepping into the unproven world of live television was viewed by the Hollywood elite as a staggering demotion. But Wendy Barrie did not see it as a defeat. She saw it as a lifeline. Survival dictates its own terms, and she embraced the new medium with a fierce, pragmatic resolve. She became a broadcasting pioneer out of sheer survival instinct. Hosting The Wendy Barrie Show, she projected the same warm, aristocratic charm that had made her a movie star. The massive sound stages were replaced by cramped studios in Manhattan, and she was now contractually obligated to look directly into the camera and sell domestic products. It was a far cry from playing royalty, but she refused to be a victim. She swallowed her pride delivered the sponsors' pitches perfectly, and conquered the format. She proved she was not a fragile, discarded starlet, but a resilient businesswoman who could rebuild her empire dollar by dollar in a world that had actively tried to destroy her. But the past is a predator that never stops hunting. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel sat on a floral-patterned sofa in a Beverly Hills mansion. He was reading the Los Angeles Times. He was relaxed. He believed he had outsmarted the East Coast syndicate bosses who had funded his failing Las Vegas casino. He believed he was untouchable. He was wrong. A sniper positioned outside the living room window leveled a .30 caliber military M1 carbine and fired. Multiple rounds shattered the glass. The bullet struck Siegel with devastating force. One round hit him in the cheek and blew his left eye entirely out of its socket. The man who had terrorized Hollywood, the man who had used Wendy Barrie as a human shield, was violently, permanently erased from the earth. The news traveled across the country instantly. Wendy Barrie read the headlines in New York. The newspaper splashed gruesome details of the assassination across the front pages. She sat in her apartment and looked at the photographs of the shattered window and the blood-stained sofa. The physical sensation she experienced was complex and terrifying. It was not joy. It was not sorrow. It was a cold, hollow shock, followed by a profound, shuddering relief. The monster was dead. The man who had held a psychological gun to her head for years was lying on a slab in the Los Angeles County morgue, but the relief was entirely physical. The psychological prison he had built around her remained intact. Bugsy Siegel was dead, but the stigma of his association clung to her skin like ash. The public devoured the details of his murder. They eagerly consumed the stories of his illicit romances. The press resurrected all the old photographs of Bugsy and Wendy smiling at the Trocadero. His death did not exonerate her. It permanently cemented her name to his violent legacy. She realized with bitter clarity that a sniper's bullet could end a mobster's life, but it could not kill a scandal. The profound hypocrisy of the American entertainment complex was fully revealed in the decades following Siegel's assassination. The Hollywood studio system, the very machine that had blacklisted Wendy Barrie for her proximity to the mob, began to actively profit from the mob's mythology. The studios romanticized the gangsters. They produced countless films glorifying the violent men who had once extorted them. They turned criminals into cinematic anti-heroes. Decades later, Hollywood would produce a lavish, big-budget motion picture about Bugsy Siegel starring Warren Beatty. They would nominate it for Academy Awards. They celebrated the murderer. They turned his bloody reign of terror into premium entertainment. Yet the woman who had actually survived his reign of terror remained firmly in exile. The studios never issued an apology to Wendy Barrie. They never offered her a role to make amends. They happily capitalized on the legend of the gangster, but they refused to clean the blood off the reputation of his victim. The men who wrote the history of Hollywood wrote Wendy Barrie out of the narrative. They preferred the myth of the dashing rogue mobster to the ugly reality of human trafficking and studio complicity. Wendy Barrie spent the remainder of her career in television. She worked steadily through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. She became a familiar, comforting presence to a generation of television viewers who knew absolutely nothing about her cinematic past or her underworld nightmare. She maintained her dignity. She did not write a sensational tell-all memoir. She did not drag the names of the cowardly studio executives through the mud. She did not beg the film industry for forgiveness because she knew she had committed no crime. She eventually found a measure of personal peace, moving away from the toxic glare of Hollywood and later marrying textile executive David L. Meyer. She had seen the absolute worst of what men with power were capable of doing, and she chose to rebuild her life on her own terms, far removed from the syndicate's shadow. The television lights eventually dimmed. The industry moved on to younger faces and newer formats. Wendy Barrie aged with the quiet, stoic grace of a woman who has survived a shipwreck and has no desire to ever return to the ocean. She retired from the public eye. She lived a quiet life on the East Coast, far removed from the palm trees and the flashbulbs of her youth. Her health eventually failed. She passed away on February 2nd, 1978, in Englewood, New Jersey. She was 65 years old. The obituaries published the next day followed a predictable, cruel pattern. Even in death, she was forced to share the headline with the hitman. The Hollywood machine had successfully branded her, and the brand outlasted her heartbeat. Her life stands as a damning indictment of the golden age, an era built by ruthless men who viewed art as a product and human beings as disposable shields. Many historians suggest she was the most valuable chip on a rigged poker table, discarded the moment she became a liability. But her true measure is not found in the scandalous headlines, nor in the films she was forbidden to make. It is found in her relentless survival. The red carpet may be an illusion designed to hide the darkness, but Wendy Barrie walked out of that darkness entirely on her own terms. She is the haunting ghost of Hollywood's most glamorous era, a permanent reminder that a woman can be broken by a corrupt system, stripped of her status, and still refuse to surrender her dignity.